five. We have 5 experts on this field and published in the Journal of Population Economics on marriage and fertility in this upcoming issue. So we're excited to hear your exciting research. And the first, I believe the first one will be given by Dr. Tara McInnish, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me share my screen here. All right.
And by the way, you're welcome to type in your question in the chat box, or feel free to unmute yourself at the end of each presentation. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so this is a paper on male wage inequality and characteristics of early mover marriages. So in this paper, we're interested, my co-author Hanny and I, we were interested in how the male wage distribution affects what we call early mover marriages. And by what we mean by early mover marriages, we mean marriages for women who are in their 20s. And so we want to understand how male wage inequality affects the formation of these early mover marriages, and particularly what types of marriages form, what types of characteristics. Okay. All right. So in order to understand how male wage inequality affects the marital formation, I first need to talk about a result that already exists in the literature about male wage inequality and marriage delay. So let me lay that groundwork first. So if you think about just a really basic sequential marital search model, where a woman receives an offer from the male wage distribution in each period and decides whether to accept that offer or continuing searching among other mates, there's going to be a reservation value that makes her just indifferent between accepting the offer and going and searching in future periods among other alternatives. So the result that already exists in the literature from Lauren is that a mean preserving increase in wage distribution, that's going to increase the expected value of a match above her current reservation wage. So that increases her returns to search. So that means is increasing male wage inequality should make women pickier, make them value continued search more, raise the women's reservation value, and extend search duration. So this basic prediction of a negative relationship between male wage inequality and the marriage rate for women under 30 has already been confirmed in a number of prior papers. But what hasn't been looked at and what this paper looks at is better understanding how male wage inequality affects the characteristics of the marriages that do form. And so that's our focus. And we're going to be focused on a couple of different characteristics of these marriages. All right. So like I said, I'm going to be using the term early mover marriage just as a shorthand for referring to marriages among women in their 20s. And first, we're going to think about how male wage inequality should affect the types of matches on husband's education and husband's earnings potential among these early mover marriages. So the key thing here is to remember that the prediction I talked about on the previous slide, that higher male wage inequality will make women pickier and raise their reservation value. That lowers the share of women in their 20s who find a match above their reservation value, or they're pickier. That means there should be fewer matches, but it also means that the matches that do form, that the early mover marriages that do form, should on average have higher quality husbands, higher educated husbands, and husbands with higher earnings potential. So that's the first prediction we're going to test, is higher male wage inequality associated with essentially matches with higher quality husbands. The other thing we point out is that something that is outside the current model and current prediction is uncertainty. The idea is that the existing model, male wage inequality increases the variance of offers received, but once a woman receives an offer, she knows her husband's lifetime earnings potential with certainty. And the point we make is that greater dispersion in male wages probably also increases uncertainty about lifetime earnings, particularly for younger men with less labor market experience. Therefore, we predict that in cases of greater male wage inequality, women may be more reluctant to marry young men who don't have as much of a labor market signal. So what this means is that women may marry with a larger marital age gap, marry older men that can send a better signal. It also may be that women who are going to marry a similar age men may delay that marriage until, say, their 30s, waiting for the men to send a stronger signal. Both of these things would result in a larger marital age gap among early mover marriages. So those are the characteristics we're going to be looking at, and our predictions for what we expect to see. All right, so we're going to do this with you for U.S. data. We're going to be using in the U.S. the decennial census and the American Community Survey data, and we're going to divide into 5 time periods: 1980, 90, 2000, using the decennial census data. And then using the ACS data, we're going to use the 2006 to 2010 time period and the 2014 to 28 time period. Okay, we're going to define marriage markets based on state, race, ethnicity, and education. So for race ethnicity, we have three categories: white, non-Hispanic, Black, non-Hispanic, and Hispanic. Education, 4 categories: less than high school, some college, and then a bachelor's degree. In looking at the effects of male wage dispersion, we're going to use multiple measures of male wage inequality. All these are going to be calculated on prime age male workers. We're going to use the standard deviation of log wages. We're going to use the Gini coefficient. And then we're also going to use the 50th to 90th percentile and the 50th to 10th percentile as measures of upper tail and lower tail inequality. Okay, so in our analysis of marriage and male wage inequality, we're going to control for a couple of characteristics. All regressions are controlled for the sex ratio and the male wage. In some regressions, we're going to additionally control for some things about the labor demand for women, the male-female wage ratio, the share of women working, and the share of women working full-time. These outcomes are sort of determined jointly with marriage, so these are potentially endogenous controls, but at the same time, it's important to check how our results are affected by those sorts of controls. We're going to proceed with 2 different analysis samples and 2 different sets of outcomes. In our first set of analysis, we're going to be looking to confirm and extend the basic prediction that male wage inequality affects marital delay. And so there we're going to be looking at women ages 22 to 30. Our main outcome variable is just going to be whether or not the woman was ever married. We're going to extend the prior literature beyond looking at marriage and also look at cohabitation, which we have from 1990 onwards. So another outcome we're going to look at is whether a woman was never married but is currently cohabitating. What we're interested in here is that if male wage inequality generates marital delays in marriage, we want to know, does that result in women simply substituting towards cohabitation, or are they not partnering at all? Our next, once we kind of confirm and extend that prior prediction about marriage rates and marriage delays, we're going to then proceed to the characteristics. And those we are looking at then only the early mover marriages, the women who are married ages 22 to 30. And there we're looking at these characteristics already discussed: indicators for husband's education, where the husband has more, the same, or less education than the wife. Earnings potential measured by average male earnings in husband's occupation, and also the marital age gap. Because our main X variable, our main explanatory variable, is inequality in the marriage market, we're going to aggregate up to marriage market by time period by age cells. Right, so that's our basic setup to show you our primary regression. So our primary regression, we're going to have our outcome variable regressed on our male wage inequality measure, starting with the standard deviation of log male wage. We're always going to be controlling for the average male wage and the sex ratio. And like I said, in some cases, adding additional controls. We will always have age fixed effects and marriage market fixed effects. So marriage market fixed effects based on the intersection of state, education, and race and ethnicity. We'll also be adding state by time period fixed effects, race and ethnicity group by time period fixed effects, education group by time period fixed effects. All right, standard errors will be clustered at the state level. Oh, this is a little bit smaller than I would have liked. All right, so this first table is the main table confirming the prior result, where we're looking at how does male wage inequality in the marriage market affect the share of women ages 22 to 30 that are ever married. And we do this for 3 separate regressions. The top regression uses standard deviation of log male wages as the measure of inequality. The middle one uses the Gini coefficient, and the last one uses both the 90th to 50th percentile and the 50th to 10th percentile as the measure of inequality. The first column, we're just using marriage market fixed effects and time period effects. The second column, we add the state by time period fixed effects. The third column, we add the education by time period fixed effects and race by time period fixed effects. And then finally, in the final column, we add these potentially endogenous controls for female labor market characteristics. Right. The key thing from this table is that we confirm the prior finding literature of a significant negative relationship. Higher male wage inequality in all of these measures is associated with a lower with marital delay and a lower rate of ever married women ages 22 to 30 in that marriage market. The one way in which we do extend the prior literature, which I've highlighted in the table, is that we're the first paper in this literature to show state by time period fixed effects, that this is robust to the inclusion of those controls. So that is one extension of the prior literature. In the next table, we further extend the prior literature to look at cohabitation. So this is doing the same analysis, but instead our outcome variable is about the rate of which women are never married but currently cohabitating. We also find significant negative effects on cohabitation, right? So this suggests that this result is not that women are simply cohabitating with women, but not cohabitating with men, but not marrying them, but actually less likely to be partnered overall. We think this makes sense because remember, the whole reason behind the marital delay is that returns to search have gone up. So women are valuing being able to search among more alternative mates. If being cohabitated also reduces your ability to search, if it's very hard to search among other potential mates while you're cohabitating, we would expect women to also become pickier about who they cohabit with, because that will also inhibit search. All right, now that we've looked at sort of marital and cohabitation delay, now we can look at our main results on the characteristics of the marriages that do form. So in this next table, I'm looking at the first 2 columns, use the outcome that the husband has more education than the wife. The middle 2 columns look at the outcome that the husband has the same education as the wife. And the last 2 columns are the husband has less education than the wife. In these cases, for each outcome, I'm reporting 2 cases. The first column, 2 specifications. The first column has all of the fixed effects, but not the potentially endogenous female labor market controls. And the second column adds those female labor market controls. We see that these results are also consistent with our prior prediction that higher wage inequality, male wage inequality is associated with more highly educated husbands. The husband's more likely to have more education than the wife, and at the same time, negatively related to the husband having the same education or less education than the wife. So this is consistent with our prediction that the higher male wage inequality will mean fewer matches, but among those matches, higher quality This table is looking at doing the same analysis, but looking at the occupational wage, the average earnings in a husband's occupation as a measure of his overall lifetime earnings potential. And we see here also that higher male wage inequality is associated with women partnering with men with higher earnings potential on average, which is again consistent with this prediction of more higher quality, higher earning men. And then our final table is looking at the marital age gap, right? So the first two columns is looking at the marital age gap, which is measured as the husband's age minus the wife's age for all marriages, for all early mover marriages in our sample for all time periods. And we do find significant positive effects of all of our male wage inequality measures, which is consistent with higher male wage inequality increasing the marital age gap. So this is consistent with our prediction that higher uncertainty in lifetime earnings generated by higher male wage inequality sort of makes women prefer men who are old enough to send a strong labor market signal. All right. The one problem with the first results in the first two tables is we're not able to control for age at marriage, which could be sort of confounding factor. So in the remaining tables, we look at couples in which we can control for age of marriage. This we can only do for first marriages in some of the years. So we don't have age of marriage information in all of the years of the data. So in the third and fourth column, I'm doing our main analysis on that restricted sample and adding the control of age of marriage. And we are robust to that inclusion of control. So the age of marriage results can hold. In the final columns, we're looking at cohabitating couples. We get positive coefficients consistent with our predictions, but we don't get significant effects for the cohabitating couples. All right, to just sort of wrap up with conclusions, we confirmed that male wage dispersion is associated with fewer early mover marriages and also, interestingly, fewer early mover cohabitations. So this suggests that cohabitation restricts marital search sufficiently that it becomes less attractive as well when returns to continued search are high. We confirmed that male wage dispersion is associated with higher quality husbands among early mover marriages using both education and occupational wages. And we also show that male wage dispersion is associated with larger marital age gaps among early mover marriages. And this is also extensive prior literature because it's just that inequality doesn't just affect marital search by changing the distribution of offers, but also by increasing uncertainty, which is something that really hadn't been paid attention to. And that is the conclusion of my talk.
Thank you so much, Tara. It's a wonderful work and so interesting, impactful. And it's time for questions, your thoughts, comments. Yeah, I will first leverage my role as the chair of this session. I would be quite interested to understand you hypothesis there could be a few characteristics and you tested them. Do you have any other surprising findings? You hypothesized that it would be like with significant pattern, but the result shows the other word.
Right.
Yeah, that's something interests me.
Right. So I think the thing that the data does not lend itself well to that would be interesting to test, because the other prediction with that is just that these matches are higher quality, so you would expect marital stability to be better. But this data set, because of it doesn't track marriages over time and you only know current status, would be less well suited to test that. But I think that would be a really interesting extension, but would require extending to some other data.
Wonderful. Any questions from the audiences? before I ask another one. Yeah, since I study inequality measures, so although the focus is on early movers, right? Those are younger females in the marriage market, but I would assume there's still disparities in their socioeconomic status, right? Their jobs. So I'm not sure whether you tested some other measures of inequality, because suppose females at a top of their socioeconomic status or the lower social ladder of the social ladder may feel differently given the same like Gini index, given the same inequality in the community.
Right.
Yeah.
No, that's a really great point. So our inequality measures are all specific, done by specific to the woman's marriage market, so to her education level. So each woman, based on their education level, their inequality measure is being done for the men in her education cell. But it could be, as you mentioned, that women are responding differently to inequality based on their social economic status. We did try to investigate that. The issue is that with our we really want to include state year fixed time period fixed effects, because we think that's really important. If you then start trying to stratify by education within that, that only leaves you race group variation to identify the effects. So it was a little bit of a trade-off between trying to keep the state year fixed effects and allowing heterogeneity. So that was a little bit of an issue for us.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your questions.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. Well, we're on time, and to thank you so much, Tara, again, and for your wonderful research, and really learned quite a lot. And let's move to the second presentation from Francisco Gallego, and who will be also speaking about his research on fertility decisions. Welcome.
Thanks a lot. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thanks. Thanks a lot for organizing this, for like the referring process in the journal, which I think improved a lot, the paper. So I'm going to present this paper, which is a joint paper with my colleague, Jan Lafortune from Catholic University of Chile. And this is a paper on basically how like commodity shocks affect some fertility decisions. And in particular, and also we try to understand mechanisms. It's basically like an empirical paper. And as I don't have a lot of time, I would like to spend, at the beginning, some time trying to motivate like the economic question. I'm going to try to motivate why we think that the context of this paper, which is using data from Chile, is interesting, then give like a preview of the results, and then I'm going to go to the details as I don't have much time. Okay, so in terms of like the economic question, there is like literature or several literatures trying to understand like how family decisions are affected by economic shocks. And this might be related to like different mechanisms, like for instance, like labor market opportunities, or public policies. In this paper, we are going to discuss basically in terms of like labor market opportunities, like related to employment, wages, etc. And also when one tries to understand like the mechanism behind like, the potential effects of economic shocks, one particularly interesting thing in our case is related to disentangling between like income and substitution effects. And this, you think like conceptually might be different for men than for women, depending on like the types of jobs or sectors that are affected by shocks. They might be also different for married versus single agents. Here in this paper, when we talk about married, we are talking also in terms of like cohabitating couples, because we don't have data to differentiate among them. So for married versus like single agents are different, like potentially like the income and substitution effects are different, because maybe like the shock affects your partner and doesn't affect you. So in that case, there is an increase in the income in the family, but your alternative cost doesn't change. And also might be different in terms of like income and substitution effects when we think about like fertility decisions in terms of extensive margin, like having a first child or not, or the intensive margin, which is more related to the number of children. One could go one step, and I have some results which are not in the paper, but I wanted to share them with you. This might also have implications on like the quality of children born under different circumstances, you know, and I'm going to discuss a little bit on that. So why we think, how we put like the commodity price shocks. And this is interesting because you think, we try to bring to this literature the fact that for many like small, in particularly open economies, commodity price shocks are really important, are huge. There might be some variation within the country, and we are going to exploit that. And also, this might be relevant because typically they are kind of exogenous shocks, which are not, you know, affected or created by local circumstances. So this is the economic question which is like having like income substitution effects, you know, questions on fertility, different margins, plus exploiting like these commodity shocks. We think that the Chile context is interesting because basically we have like a small open economy subject to different commodity prices. And we have like, you think about, you know, how Chile is like a long, thin country, you know, basically there are like different areas with different endowments. So you have like changes in international prices that are not correlated among them and affect in a different way, like different regions. And we are going to exploit variation both in terms of time variation in prices of different products, you know, in different sectors. I'm going to explain this in a second. And we are going to use like pre-sample, the pre-sample structure of production to allocate these shocks to different regions in Chile. So that's like the variation in terms of like commodity price shocks for Chile. Then we also exploit, and I think this is interesting, that we have high frequency data on all birth in the country from admit data, and actually including observable characteristics of both the fathers and the mothers of the kids, the children, you know, and we are going to exploit that and merge that with which we can like aggregate at the county level and combine price commodity price shocks with fertility outcomes at the country level and exploit that variation to understand mechanisms and results. In terms of the results, let me show you like the main results of the preview, quick preview. First, we show that, which is kind of like the first stage, even though we don't have like IV estimates, but it's basically we show that commodity price shocks do, in a panel data context, do have like impacts on employment rates at the local level. And as this is a panel data setting, we control for time and county fixed effects. We also show that typically the employment effects are stronger for men than for women. And you can think, here you can start thinking about substitution and income effects and how they are different for different people. Then we show that, which is something which is in the previous literature, that these improvements in local conditions that we map to commodity price shocks increase fertility outcomes, like the number of births and the birth rate. But we argue that we have like a more exogenous shock and different mechanisms. And then we double click, and we, using exploiting our data set, we try to understand, you know, what's going on behind that. And we find that there is an increase in birth, which is not explained by the extensive margin, but just by the intensive margin, which is basically like the number of kids born after the first one. Second, that there is this increase in birth is moved basically by an increase like in birth in families with employed fathers. So it's not single mom families, you know. Third, and this is kind of an interesting and a bit counterintuitive effect, result, that we find that there is kind of polarization in terms of who increases like the birth rate. And we find that the increases are basically driven by increases by both low-skilled mothers and high-skilled mothers. And let me double click this result, which is like the last part of the slide, which is that you think about like income and substitution effects. We complement this with employment effects for the same groups. And what we find is the following. For low-skilled mothers, we find no employment effect for them, but positive shocks for other adults living like in the household, which is typically mapped to the fathers of the kids. So in this case, you see that basically it seems that there is no substitution effect for the mothers because there is no increase in terms of like the economic opportunities, but there is an increase in the economic opportunities of their partners, which probably is more related to an income effect. So then you can explain this increase in the birth rate for low-income families. What happens with medium-skilled families, you know, or mothers, sorry. In this case, we find the opposite. Given the occupations they have, we do find an employment effect, a positive employment effect for them, but we don't find an employment effect for men, for the other people, adults living in the household. So in this case, probably it is substitution effect which dominates income effects, and then it is consistent with our result that basically we don't find an increase in the birth rate for medium-skilled mothers, sorry. And finally, for high-skilled mothers, we find that there are like positive employment effects both for them and for men living in the same household. So in this case, we have both income and substitution effect. So we don't know a priori, you know, what's going on, you know, but this is consistent also with an increase in fertility outcomes for these families. Okay. Finally, in terms of like the preview of the results, we don't find that the price, because we can exploit both price shocks at the time of conception, which is like the choice time in a sense, you know, and at this time when kids are born. And we don't find impacts of price shocks at the time of birth, but we do have like effects of price shocks at the time of conception. So this is kind of a placebo effect, which we think is important for the results in the paper. I'll skip the literature but many papers that are important. Okay, so let me move now to, basically I have like 8 minutes, you know, 7 minutes and plus epsilon, you know, and let me show you like the estimating equation, how we construct the price shocks, and then move quickly to the results, which are very, very simple in a sense, given the setting of the paper. So we are going to exploit like basically panel data, you know, and we're going to have like some outcome Y at county T at time T, county C, sorry, at time T. We're going to have time and county fixed effects, and we're going to construct this set variable, which is the commodities price shock of county C at time T. This is going to be the product for 7 different sectors, which are copper, other metal mining, agriculture, petroleum, fisheries, forestry, and manufacturing. We have the prices of these products in these sectors using macro data. And then we are going to weight those shocks times the economic structure of county C before our sample, which is 1992. You can do like averages, average like structure, and you get more or less the same result. So then we have something which is varies at the time level, varies at the county level, and we adapt this for the 7 like sectors that we include in our index. Something very important. Now let me like try to convince you that we have variation, which is interesting, you know. So what we have here, which is not in the paper, but I think it's a nice way of looking at what's going on. So in this case, I have like 100 random counties from our data set. And in the top figure, I have like the time variation of the index for each county, using like the weights of different commodity prices times the economic structure, and there is variation in the country, you know. So you can see in the top panel that there is like there is variation, you know, and there is a trend at the end. But if you present like the variation of the price index, parceling out time and county fixed effects, which is what you are going to exploit in the panel data context, you have what is in the bottom panel. And let me move you, focus on like in the middle of the panel, like around quarter 40, which is, you can do the math and think how many years are after the beginning of the sample. And there you can see that there is a lot of variation in terms of like that for some countries at that time, there is a positive price shock of about 10 log points. But at the same time, you have some counties, where you have like a negative shock, which is like minus 10 log points. So this variation is something that we're going to exploit, you know, in terms of like the identification. In terms of data, we use like a bunch of admin data. I'll go quickly on this, you know, admin data that from the Ministry of Health. We have basically the census of all birth. We identify some characteristics of the mothers, in particular, like education, the same for the father, you know. We know what, in which county the mother was living when the kid was born. We aggregate this, then we combine this with data on employment outcomes at the county or regional level. I'll skip this because I don't have a lot of time. And then we do the estimation. Okay, so main, like first, and this is table 2 in the paper, basically we show that the variation after controlling for time and county fixed effects, there is an increase in employment rates associated with this increase in commodity price index, you know, with commodity price shocks. We have a bunch of different specifications related to different like sources of information for employment outcomes for different periods, you know, excluding Santiago, including the minor regions in Chile, and we get more or less the same similar like outcomes. Then, and this is important for this story of trying to disentangle between substitution and income effects, in this table, we have the same, but we disaggregate by education level of the mother. You can see low skilled mothers here are having like, they have like less than high school diploma. Mid-skilled mothers, they just have like a high school diploma, and high skilled mothers have a university degree or some higher education degree. And you can see here that the price index, while in average has a positive impact, as I just showed you in the previous table, there is heterogeneity in terms of the impacts. For low-skilled mothers, as I said at the beginning, like there is like a zero effect, but for low-skilled fathers, you know, or men, basically, you know, you have like a positive shock. If you move now to the mid of the education distribution of mothers, you know, there is a positive effect for mothers when there is like this commodity price shock, but a zero effect for fathers. And then if you move to the high skilled group, you know, you have positive effects for both. So a priori, you know, income and substitution effects might be different for these groups. Now, let me move to like the impact on like fertility outcomes. You know, what we find is that positive commodity price shocks increase the birth rate, log birth. As I said before, you can see this in column 3 and 4. The increase in the number of kids is mostly related to not to firstborn children, just to the intensive margin. And basically, like the share of people moving this increase in fertility is related to married moms, you know, where they might have, you know, stronger income effects for single moms. So I have like less than 1 minute. If you double click this, and this is like a big table, it's smaller than what I expected to show you, you know, but basically if you double click this, the results by educational level are consistent with the view that what's driven here is related to income and not substitution effects. Okay, placebo test, if you do the same exercises, not at the, the placebo test is here. You do the same exercises, not at the time of conception, but you add like the price shocks at birth. When the kids are born, you know, you see zero impacts of price shocks then, but the positive impact of at the time of conception. And just to finish, because I have like 2 seconds, you know, so our interpretation of these results is that we seem to have like exogenous shocks. Our data set suggests that there is like this income effect dominating substitution effects, and this might be consistent with the particular structure of the economy, and also with the fact that it seems that the intensive margin is what's driving the results. We also have some results on the quality of the kids born, which are not in the paper, and suggest that there is no impact in terms of like the quality, and this is also might be consistent. It's different from previous papers, might be consistent with that. What's going on here is like that there is an income effect dominating the results. So that's it. Sorry, I spent like 45 seconds more than expected, but sorry about that.
Thank you so much, Francisco. Wonderful talk and questions. Class.
Oh, good.
Yeah, Class and Tara.
Tara, you can go first if you want.
Sure. So Francisco, I was wondering if you could say something more about why the effect is on the high order bursts and not on firstborn. What's the sort of the rationale or explanation for that?
Okay, so we have like a discussion in the paper. It's not a formal model, Tara, but basically the idea we have is that probably what's going on here is that you already have, children, you know, probably you are not that attached to the labor market. So when you get like this positive income shock in your household, you know, you basically, the substitution effect that would send you to the labor market is not that strong for you because you already have some kids, you know. That's the main rationale of the result. Yeah, it's related to like labor market attachment, basically. Yeah.
My question was, how do you deal with household decision-making differences with our partners?
Well, we don't have, so we don't have a close like a discussion on that in the paper. We basically, it's very like reduced form in that sense, you know. And we wanted something, actually was a comment in the refereeing process, and we didn't have data on that, is that if we could like differentiate between like cohabitating and married partners, we could, couples, sorry, we could like discuss with detail that, but we don't have data. Unfortunately, in the admin data, they just say, you know, do you have like a couple or not, you know, and we cannot differentiate like that margin. Yeah.
But you have men, let's say, who are singles and men who are married. No,
because the men we get in the data set for the fertility part are just, you know, somebody who is related to a baby in a sense, you know. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thanks to you.
Hi, Patty. Your question. Please unmute yourself.
Sorry. I like your paper, Francisco, and I find it very interesting how you find information to try to distinguish the income versus the substitution effect. I was wondering if you could do something in addition, which, I mean, the paper is already published, but maybe for further research. So because it seems that you're using the index, right? The index of these 7 prices. And I was wondering if you could separate them, for example, having mining prices, which are much more indicative of men labor versus, for example, agricultural prices, which might affect female labor more. And in this way have differential effects on the labor responses from men versus women and therefore income versus substitution effect. And the other thing that I was wondering if you have age of childbearing and whether you could find some effect on age of childbearing or not. That was it.
Thanks. Great questions and suggestions for further research. The first one, we didn't try, and there is something interesting, Patty, which is the following, that it may be the same in Peru and in Chile, you know, that the mining shocks, and there is a previous paper that explored this by Ben Feimeger, who is now at a university, I forgot, in Chicago, the university close to Chicago, where basically mining has also an impact like on local public finance, because there is like a convoluted, like, redistribution scheme. And in that sense, your point is really interesting, because as you said, we could differentiate between men and women. We do have something like that in the paper. It's not exactly what you said, but also we could like exploit like this public finance mechanism, which is not in the paper. We did have something like that in previous versions, but on the second point, we don't. So basically, we don't find effects on the age of childbearing, as far as I remember. We did have some results before, but I think we don't find effects on that. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, we have 2 more minutes. Any other questions?
Sheila has or not?
Yes, sir. Hello.
Yes.
Yeah. Sir, I'm a research scholar, and being the research scholar, we are always posed with this question of the R-square value not approaching 1, like 0.99. So in one of your tables, and especially in table 4, where your R-square in the first column went around 0.095, like those interests are in results are very interesting. But as a research scholar, when we are asked this question, why your R-square is like not 0.99 or 0.88, how do we actually explain that? So like my question is regarding that only.
Oh,
So the table 4, yeah.
No, that's very, I was trying to look at the table, This probably is because we have time and county fixed effects. Yeah, but let me check that. I think that's what's going on here, Yeah.
Okay.
But we didn't notice this actually. Let me check that. I cannot see the paper here, but it's a great point. Yeah.
So, like, have you found some papers where the R-square value is actually 0.0, 0.05 or 0.04 somewhere, and then the results are quite intriguing in that sense. So, how do we actually explain that? I mean, why the R-square value is quite low, but the results are actually intriguing in that case? So, that's my question.
So, I was looking at the tables. So.
Table 4, sir.
Table 4.
Table 4 that you presented, yeah. Impact of exogenous economic shocks on employment by education and education of the mother.
Is this OLS or is this logic
No, this is OLS.
PPT, the same presentation, yeah.
But so I don't, well, I don't know. I don't know if I have an answer on that, a good answer.
Okay.
I think this is like panel data, and we have like the variation in the 2 levels, and yes. In general, maybe it's a bias I have, but I don't look a lot at R squares, but maybe this is the way. Yeah. But I think more about that, I don't have a clear answer to your question.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
That's great discussion. Yeah, and I think that's the beauty of this, all these GOP sessions, because all the papers being rigorously reviewed, published, so we can talk about broader ideas for future future research, and perhaps collaborations. And without further ado, let's move to the next speaker, Yanni Shannon, and who will talk about the compulsory schooling laws and child labor restrictions on fertility. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Okay, so hi everybody. So I will give some context to the paper. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, the United States experienced a sharp reduction in the prevalence of child labor, alongside a large decline in fertility. And child labor was almost completely eradicated by the mid-20th century. And fertility rates of women dropped from an average of around 7 live births during the early 19th century to less than 3 children by 1930. And there were many forces underlying the demographic transition. And what I do in this paper is I use census data to try and understand whether the introduction of compulsory school attendance laws and child labor regulation have also contributed to the large decline in fertility during that period. So first, why should we think that regulating child labor would affect fertility? So if we believe that parents weigh the utility from children against their cost, then if it is optimal for some parents to send their children to work, then laws that punish or ban child labor will reduce the returns to child labor, so making the children more expensive. And this idea is not new. It was previously modeled and formalized in the macro growth theory literature, but this was the first attempt to test this empirically. So the goal, again, is to estimate the fertility response of households to child labor restriction and its implicit effect on utility obtained from children. But the problem is that fertility is likely correlated with unobserved determinants of compulsory schooling laws and child labor regulation. So what I do is I exploit variation in restrictions on child labor generated by changes in legislation in the US across states over time. Specifically, I compare the fertility of women who lived in the same states but were exposed to different child labor restrictions during the prime fertility years. And the main identifying assumption here is that in the absence of these restrictions, there would have been no differential changes in fertility across states within each census region. So I will give some historical background and then focusing on children who are between the age of 10 and 15 in the 1900 to 1930 census samples, I will try to see whether the laws were effective in restricting child labor. And then moving on to fertility, focusing on older women in the 1940 full count census, I will try to understand whether the laws had an impact on completed fertility. And last, using a woman year level panel I construct using the same census data of birth ranging from 1891 to 1930 of younger women to see whether exposure to such laws is associated with lower likelihood to give birth. So during that period, children were legally employed in many industries. Most of them were in agriculture, but many also in manufacturing and services. And state level compulsory schooling laws were first introduced in 1852 by Massachusetts and gradually expanded throughout the US. By 1920, all states had compulsory schooling law. These laws specified an age at which children had to begin attending school and an age they could leave. And legislation was primarily motivated by the need to remedy the problem of limited attendance and as a way to promote the idea of an inclusive primary education. Mass immigration from Europe was also a factor. This was thought as a tool to assimilate foreigners into the country. Now, these compulsory schooling laws were often complemented with separate child labor regulation that exempted working children from full-time school attendance. They also specified an age or completed schooling requirement needed to be reached in order to enter the labor force. And in the study, I used previously collected data on these laws provided by Karen Clay and her co-authors. And I calculate the effective age a child can stop attending school and work full-time given the legislation in each state at any point in time from 1880 to 1930. So this is a map of the effective school exit age over time. You can see that the laws varied considerably by state over time. Darker blue means children will be able to leave school and work full time at later ages. So this is the variation I explored basically. Okay, so I started by estimating whether laws were effective in restricting child labor and increasing school attendance. So I look at 10 to 15-year-old native-born children in the census, and I look at the probability a child will be employed or in school as a function of whether he's required to do so according to the law, given his age, state of residence, and census year. And I control for the individual and household level characteristics that are available in these historical censuses, and also age fixed effects, state fixed effects, and region specific year fixed effects. So here, column 1 and 2 report the impact of a law in place requiring a child to be in school and not in the labor market on employment with and without controls. So taking into account the sample means, these estimates translate into a 25% decline in the probability to be employed, and here to a 5% increase in the probability to be in school. And this is important because if the restrictions on children's labor supply are not binding or simply not enforced, it is unlikely that parents will take them into account when deciding on family size. Moving on to fertility, I used the 1944 count census to estimate the effect of child labor restrictions on completed fertility by exploiting this within state variation in exposure to the laws from birth to age 30, while controlling for state fixed effects and core specific effects. The exposure measures on the right-hand side are based on whether there was any law that restricted child labor during a certain period in a woman's life, or alternatively, the average effective school age during that decade. And this specification allows me to examine the effect of exposure to child labor restrictions at different stages of life. Its drawback is that it cannot account for potential differential time trends because it's a single census year. So the results here suggest that child labor restrictions during early childhood has no impact, while exposure at later stages in life negatively affect fertility. Exposure from age 10 to 20 is associated with a 0.12 decrease in fertility, which is a 4% drop. And this is the time period in which women's own labor supply and educational attainment were directly affected by these laws in the state. So this effect here could be explained by a higher opportunity cost following an increase in human capital. But looking at exposure from age 20 to 30, it's associated with a significantly larger effect on fertility. We see here something like a 10% drop in fertility. Here, columns 1 and 2 display the corresponding estimates using the alternative average school exit age instead of the indicator. And we see a similar pattern in which exposure at earlier ages is not associated with differential fertility, whereas the average school age, school exit age in one's 20s has a clear negative impact on fertility. In columns 3 and 4, I use slightly older women to look at also exposure from age 30 to 40. It's also significant, but seems not as large as this decade. Next, I estimate the effect of exposure to these restrictions in one's 20s, where we saw the largest impact on the probability to give birth using a woman year level panel of birth ranging from 1891 to 1930, and the birth indicators here are based on the ages of the children that can be linked to the mothers in each household. And to reduce measurement error due to older children not necessarily being present in the household, this is done by considering only children under the age of 10 at the time of the census. And here, the identification stems from exploring the within-state variation in exposure to laws, while controlling not only for age-specific effects, but also for regional time effects. Okay, so column 1 and 2 report the effects of exposure to any child labor restrictions with and without individual level controls. We see a significant decrease. This amounts to roughly 6% decrease relative to baseline fertility. And the results hold when allowing for state specific time effects, and also when using state of residence and state of birth, and also in column 6 when considering a shorter exposure interval from age 22 to 27, given that these 10-year intervals are pretty arbitrary. In column 4, I report the results of a placebo test based on the idea that if the timing of the laws is exogenous to fertility trends, conditional on all the fixed effects, then child labor restriction in a given period should not affect or explain the fertility levels of earlier cohorts. So this not work the other way around, which is reassuring. And I also get similar results when considering the average school exit age instead of a dummy for any restrictions. Now the paper, I perform many other robustness checks. Among other things, I check whether the state level differences in infant and child mortality may be driving the results. It seems that they don't. And also, as many of you know, recent work has questioned the validity of such diff and diff designs where identification is based on variation in treatment timing across states and time periods. So I also make use of one of the new proposed estimators in the literature as another robustness check and get similar but less precise results. Another nice exercise is that if I do like a cross-border analysis where I focus only on neighboring counties that are of different states, and use only the variation across these counties that are theoretically more similar to one another, but the main difference is the legislation, which is different, I get practically identical results. Okay, so to summarize this short talk, my findings suggest that labor market restrictions on working children in the early 20th century were effective in reducing the prevalence of child labor. And in turn, it seems that they had spillover effects on the fertility of parents, which seem to have internalized the implicit increase in the cost of children. According to my preferred specifications, that when women exposed to the laws in their 20s experience an 8% decrease in completed fertility and a 6% decrease in the annual probability to give birth at ages 25 to 35. And a simple back of the envelope calculation that I do in the paper suggests that the increasing exposure during these 3 decades to child labor market restrictions can account for roughly 8% of the overall fertility decline during that period, and that's it. I hope I was on time.
Yeah, thank you so much. Wonderful presentation. So yeah, very interesting. Any questions, comments, thoughts?
One quick thing. I'm wondering if we should think about these effects as, to the extent that these laws may have been passed as sort of demand for child labor was declining, Should we think of these more broadly as just rather than necessarily the direct effect of the law, but basically the effect of a decline in child labor broadly, whether that was generated by economic labor market forces or the law itself?
Yeah, so these models are an attempt to specifically focus on the legislation, conditional on like the state of the specific economy in each state. We know that it wasn't random, right? The timing wasn't random. For example, of the legislation. For example, we know that states that already had high attendance rates in school were earlier to adopt such laws, but it seems that it gave an additional push to even further increase school attendance and eradicate child labor. So I interpret the findings as the effect of the laws and not any underlying reason that these laws were implemented. And that is why I try so hard to control for every possible state or time effect that is related to these concerns.
I guess I was more thinking about changes happening within states over time that may be associated with the support for the laws.
Okay.
I have a clarification question about the law. So does that relate to the date of birth? Is there a cutoff for age? I mean, for or a certain date that's
it might have been, but there is no date on that. So all we have is information on when was a law enacted and what did it state. Basically, like an entrance, an age they should enter school, an age they could leave unconditionally, and so on. And even if I had it, I couldn't use census data to examine it because it's really not ideal to look at like specific date of birth. And I infer like birth using the children in the household, for example. I just count the heads. Right. And, yeah. But it could have been very else.
I was asking because there's a large literature using the school leaving age policy, right, with the compulsory school law, which will generate some variation even within the children of the same age. But
that's a better design, definitely.
Yeah, thank you. I have another question about the the next step. Since you look at the quantity, right, of children they have. So the natural question may be asking the quality.
What about the quality?
Yeah, so would you be able to say something in the next step, or is already on your agenda?
So I haven't done anything of the sort in this paper, but I could think about also maybe considering quality and not over quantity, not only quantity in the next project.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? I think we still have 2 minutes.
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
So I was wondering if you had data to do the event studies that you can show that's related to the previous question. So if you managed to see some previous trend or not. And then the other question that I had was if you managed to see any difference by gender?
By difference by gender of the child?
Yeah.
You mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the second question, no, I actually looking at heterogeneous effects, both on the how effective were the laws in restricting child labor. Looking at heterogeneous effects, it seems like both boys and girls and children of different type of households were affected pretty similarly, with the only exception, if I remember correctly, that it did not affect non-white children. And this, we can think about various reasons why that is the case, why it's the case, and the same goes for fertility. We see like a pretty stable effect across subgroups. Yeah, and the first question was regarding the event study. Yeah, so I had some attempts at doing like an event study analysis, but it failed. I didn't see anything, basically anything robust and clear, so it was dropped.
Thank you so much, Yanni. That's a great discussion and impactful study. And I think although it's an American setting, but it's definitely a lot of implications for developing world. Now let's move to the fourth talk by Patricia Ritter. The floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Can you see my, yeah?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So, hi everybody. So I'm happy to present this paper that I wrote with Ricardo Sanchez on the effects of an epidemic on prenatal investment, childhood mortality, and health of surviving children. So the motivation was that, as we know now more than ever, epidemics have been on the rise, and really for past several decades, and according to experts, is likely to continue to do so in the future. And the potential death attributable to an epidemic is considerably larger than the death directly associated. So we typically count the death from people that are infected, and that's the account of that we have, but we know from excess death and other statistics that the potential death count is typically much larger. And in particular, children that are exposed to an epidemic while in utero are particularly vulnerable. So in this study, we're going to explore the health and parental investment effects of prenatal exposure to the Peruvian cholera epidemic in the early 90s. So the cholera epidemic in Peru in the early 90s, it's a great context, I believe, to analyze these outcomes from an econometrics perspective, because it was completely abrupt and unexpected. This is a quote from the New York Times at that time, that says, disease control experts are largely at loss to explain why cholera has returned to South America in the first epidemic since 1895, so 100 years later. And so it was completely unexpected and abrupt. And the initial cases are apparently driven by ecological conditions from the Pacific Ocean, so plausible exogenous condition. It was spread super rapidly, and it was largely determined by geographic, so it would expand to the next or the closest region, altitude, and temperature especially, and rainfall. By the end of 1991, it has spread to 14 countries in Latin America, but Peru was responsible for 83% of all cases. So very strong epidemic in Peru, started completely unexpected, spread very rapidly, and apparently due to plausible exogenous causes. This is a little bit for you to see how cases vary. And here you can see how it varies in 3 different regions in Peru: the coast, the mountains, highland, and the jungle. And you can see lots of variation across regions, but also within region over time. So imagine that we are worried about maybe there is some correlation between sanitation conditions, right? And so for this to be driven by sanitation conditions, we would need it that sanitation conditions suddenly worsen very badly, but then improve very abruptly as well, only a couple of months later. So it's really a very almost like random variation that we are exploiting. So how can a color epidemic end up causing childhood mortality or effects on health? So first, an infected woman, a pregnant woman that has cholera can transmit it to the fetus through the placenta. And even if it's not transmitted this way, the symptoms of the disease of the pregnant mother can affect the fetus, because the symptoms of cholera are very, very severe, dehydration that are very bad for the fetus, stress, in some cases fever, etc. But as a typical epidemics also have an economic impact. So even if the pregnant woman itself was not infected by the virus or bacteria in this case, you could have, if your area is heavily affected by it, it would have economic repercussions that can affect your investments. And also, as we have seen now more than ever, it can affect the capacity of the healthcare sector. And so if you're a pregnant woman and the hospital is full of cholera patients, you may not be able to have your prenatal consultations, which is not just about vaccines and ultrasounds. It's also about education, not smoking, not drinking, etc., proper nutrition. And then, of course, very importantly, you may not be able to give birth in an institution, and non-institutional birth in Peru are very high. And in this time, we were talking about 40% of women not giving birth in a proper medical institution. So through these effects, it's possible that it affects the fetus, and then the fetus die later on. So empirical strategy, we exploit a difference in difference empirical approach with exploiting the variation in color across cohorts and regions. We also do some of the robustness check from Ches, Martin, and his co-author. And we complement this strategy with sibling fixed effects. So we first do the typical difference in difference with event studies, and then we look at a pair of siblings and compare them. So this is more or less, so this is just to show you that we obviously include all the fixed effect, but also region-specific trends. And at the beginning, we start by analyzing the 3 trimesters in utero. We also do the entire year. We also check some trimesters just after birth, etc. And most of our effects, or the most clear effects, are in the 3rd trimester. And this is probably because the 1st trimester, there are more miscarriages. So that could go against our results. We cluster the standard errors at the regional level, but we get our p-values from wild bootstrap inference to correct for a small number of regions. Okay, so main results, we find that an increase in 1 standard deviation in the incidence of cholera during the last trimester in utero increases childhood mortality by about 4%. And we find that the effect was not driven by pre-existing trends. So this is, for example, the effect on child mortality. And we see basically no pre-existing trend. And this is, for example, a placebo with the education of the mother, and we see no effect on the education of the mother. We also find that surviving children are more likely to suffer from severe diarrhea, lower weight for age, and underweight. And then we also look at prenatal investment, and we see a reduction in prenatal care and institutional deliveries. And we also find that most of our effects in mortality are concentrated on first-day mortality. So this suggests that the effects on mortality and other and possibly other longer type of effects of prenatal exposure to cholera might be driven by a reduction in prenatal investments and institutional deliveries. So contributions, so we hope we contribute with the literature concerning prenatal shocks. We know that's a wide literature, but most of this paper focus on long-term effects. And a small number of studies are focused on postnatal childhood mortality, but there are very different types of shocks. So this is, I believe, the first paper that analyzed the effect of prenatal exposure to an epidemic on childhood mortality. This is important, first of all, because it provides us a better estimate of the magnitude of the human cost of an epidemic. So in our case, for example, if we take into account not just the direct immediate death of infected person, but also of the children who were affected prenatally by the cholera epidemic, the human cost, meaning the amount of death, is 30% larger. So it's an important number. Another way to look at this is to understand that the official mortality rate for cholera epidemic in Peru during 1991 was 9 in every 100,000 inhabitants. So for every 100,000 inhabitants that were infected with cholera, 9 died. But if we look at prenatal exposure, directly or indirectly, we have that of every 100,000 children that were exposed to cholera, 150 prenatally, 150 end up dying. It's much, so the rate, mortality rate is much stronger when you are in utero. Other type of contribution is the importance of the potential role of prenatal investment and institutional delivery as mediator between the shock and the effects on childhood mortality and maybe longer term effects. So most papers in this literature focus on prenatal shock and then the effects, and some of them look at postnatal investment of parents, but it's more like the children is born, there is a shock, and so they try to either compensate or reinforce with their investment that shock. What we find is something different, is that we find that the effects of the shock itself might not be necessarily for the disease itself of the shock itself, but for this effect that has in parents' investment. And so, and in the health capacity of the region, right? And so, and these apply not only for epidemics, but if you have a hurricane, war, famine, whatever, all these things might affect severely the supply of healthcare. And this is particularly important for institutional delivery. According to the World Health Organization, about 40% of all under 5 child deaths are neonatal death, and approximately half of neonatal death occur after a home birth without any healthcare. So it's believed that non-institutional birth is an important cause of neonatal mortality. And finally, we hope to contribute to the literature on diarrheal disease, childhood mortality, and malnutrition. Of course, we have seen that part of our effects seems to be driven by the effect on prenatal, on parental investments, but we cannot discard the potential direct role of the disease on the mortality estimates. And cholera is a diarrheal disease, and diarrheal disease are kill around 500,000 children every year, and are the leading cause of malnutrition. But these estimates are only from the direct effects. So a child gets diarrhea and then it dies. But if we include this potential prenatal exposure in later childhood, the effects could be even worse. And this is important because most children are targeted to deal with diarrhea after the children are born, right? But the study suggests that protecting children from this disease after they're born might be too late for some of them. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Patty. Thank you so much. Great presentation. Now, time for questions, comments, thoughts. Any ideas? Yeah, let me see the time. Yeah. Yeah, we still have 10 minutes for discussion. Yeah, if any of you have a. Yeah, maybe I just get started to ask a question about. So the investigation is conditional on the survival. So the babies who at least survive to the birth, right? So, so do we have any guess or estimates or previous literature about how cholera may affect those not being carried to birth, and what's the size of that compared to the mortality after birth?
Yeah, we have information, but it's not as good as we would like to. But there is several qualitative research that shows that cholera is a disease that do cause significant amount of miscarriage. Unfortunately, we don't have a measurement that would tell you this is the impact or this was the impact in 1991, because we didn't have good data about it. But there is lots of small studies that show effect on miscarriage, most of them during the first trimester. And that's probably why my effects of the first trimester are much more noisy and smaller. But if anything, it accounts against my results, right? But yes, there is an important effect on miscarriage.
Yeah, any other question? And then one measure is use the first day mortality. Why is that something people have consensus to use in the literature? Because I was thinking I remember more people perhaps measure 30-day mortality and for longer time follow-up. Why focusing on the first day?
Oh, it's because I wanted to verify whether some of these deaths were actually complications during birth.
Oh, I see.
And because there is such a strong impact on institutional delivery. And so imagine if you're at home giving birth and you need a C-section or you have an infection, right?
Right.
And so it's very hard for the mother or the baby to survive. Yeah. That's why.
Yeah. Another thing, perhaps you already checked the socioeconomic portfolio of babies who were born to lower socioeconomic status mothers versus higher, whether they were dying disproportionately, and how that potentially affected the longer term socioeconomic inequality.
Yes, the effect was much stronger for lower educated mothers. And I don't remember right now other heterogeneous effect that we saw, but generally mothers with lower resources were affected greatly. And also something that we don't see in this research, but it would be interesting to look at, is some of these mothers die as well, right? Because, so this is another reason why my research is downward biased, because I only see the kids of mother who survive.
Right.
But if I would have the complete sample, situation could be even worse, right? Because some mothers certainly die, especially if they don't have this situational birth.
Right. And yeah, another potential factor that drive this result to be more conservative would be like at the conception, like mothers may choose not to be pregnant if they have such choice, right? Especially we did some work looking at environmental pollution and births. We also find a similar pattern. Those of lower who has lower income tend to avoid the time period, no matter whether it's hot weather or it's like polluted water. Even in America, like using Flint water crisis as an example, mothers may tend to
so in this particular study, we don't find fertility selection because, as I mentioned to you, most of the effects were of mothers who were in the 3rd trimester, so cholera killed them and they were pregnant already.
Right.
But later on, when I start to analyze the effect for later periods, you see the effects vanishing, and I think it's because selection. I think it's mother begin to not having kids or take precautions. So, and also because the epidemic was not that strong later on.
Yeah, it could be heterogeneous effect based on the timing of the birth, timing of the conception. Yeah.
Exactly.
Any other questions? Or ideas for future work? If no, then we move to the next one. I hope to give you a few minutes as a gift back to you at the end of the session. So let's welcome our last but not least presentation from Harry Krasinski. Yeah,
I'm impressed that you got my name. Yeah, that's not an easy name.
Yeah, and you initially your talk was after another talk on the compulsory education law, but still very relevant, and everything is about fertility. Yeah, it's so cohesive session. Yeah, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. Well, so before I begin, I want to thank Shi for running the session. I also want to thank Klaus for inviting me to the session. This is a nice honor. I want to thank Patty in particular for being willing to flip with me in the presentation order. I was actually in class today, and so I tried to rush back as quickly as I could to get involved with the presentation. So I'm grateful for that. So thank you all. So this is a paper about the impact of education on what I'm calling overall fertility. And I know it's a sort of a very general description. So let me kind of dig into what it is I'm talking about. So in the end, what I'm going to do is something that echoes to some extent what Yane was doing, which is using compulsory schooling laws in order to generate random variation in educational attainment to try to see how it is that education was causally affecting various aspects of fertility. And so what I'm going to show you is that, many of the sort of what we call kind of the classic models of fertility, they sort of think about what is just the intensive margin of fertility. There's this notion of the trade-off between quantity and quality of children, and that's the thing that motivates the choice of the number of children to have. But there have been a few more recent papers, one of which is, the editor who handled my paper at the Journal of Population Economics, Oded Galor, who's talked about not only the extensive margin of fertility, but rather not only the intensive margin of fertility, but also the extensive margin of fertility. That is the decision to have any children at all in conjunction with the decision to have a non-zero number of children. And what we're going to show you is that in the end, there's what we call sort of a compressing effect of education on overall on fertility. That is, it makes women less likely to have no children at all. It makes them more likely to have at least one child. but it makes them less likely to have a lot of children. So instead of having more people in the tails, those tails kind of get moved in through education. And we're going to talk about some of the mechanisms that are involved. One of the other things is that we had to kind of negotiate what is one of the big problems with this literature, which is that there's an assumption that education leads to improved labor market opportunities, and that in so doing, that changes fundamentally the price, the shadow price of having a child. One of the things that has become problematic in the literature, as I will talk about, is that particular notion has been challenged. So we had to use, sort of new data to try to address this concern and sort of show not only that in the context where education has a meaningful impact on income, there's also a meaningful impact on fertility as well. So how do I get there? So I know the time is limited, so I'll sort of do a warp speed review of the existing literature. What I call the initial or kind of the classic literature really starts off with the work of Becker. And that work demonstrates the fundamental trade-off between quantity and quality. And the argument is basically that the more investment per child, that is what they call the quality, the more costly it is to have a large number of children, and vice versa. There's sort of a positive relationship between the shadow price of quantity of children and quality of children. And, that's something that's quite well established. The more recent literature, though, not only, as I said, talks about that notion of quantity-quality trade-off on the intensive margin, but it also asks the question about the extensive margin. And this has been a much more recent critique, because the original models it's sort of make an assumption about something called the Anata condition. So if you're familiar with this literature, you know that that has been critiqued. And so in order to kind of incorporate a more fulsome model, you have people like Galore who have talked about this in some detail. And so what are the main ideas? Well, the idea is this, that basically that if there is a fall in the price of child quality, then this will have a negative effect on the intensive margin. That is, it will decrease the number of children that women have, but it will have a positive effect on the extensive margin. That is, it makes women more likely to have at least one child. And that's what we're going to call the compression of the fertility distribution. On the other side, what these new models show is that if there is an increase in the price of child quantity, then this will decrease both the intensive and extensive margins of fertility. So if if the price of child quantity goes up, then what the new models show is that it should make women less likely to have more children, and it should make women less likely to have children at all. So why is this important? Okay, well, here's the basic idea. There's an argument that improved labor market opportunities will increase the price of child quantity for women, and that comes down to the notion of opportunity costs of time away from the market. Remaining married, though, it has been argued, should decrease the price of child quality compared to being a single parent. There are a number of papers in the literature that talk about this. The essence of the idea is that if women and men have the ability to share the cost of in making investments in child quality, then this should be smaller than if somebody is a single parent and they have to make these investments all on their own, both in terms of time and in terms of money. What we're going to do in the paper is document some new evidence with compulsory schooling laws that show how actually random variation can be created for both issue number 1 and issue number 2. That is, compulsory schooling laws can create random variation in both the price of quantity and the price of quality. In addition to that, this is going to be comparatively modern data. There are a lot of studies that use data that are somewhat older. Yanné was one of those. So he was using data from the first half of the 20th century. What we're going to do is we're going to use somewhat more recent data than that, just to investigate whether or not these types of patterns are evident closer to more modern times. So what are the key findings? Well, again, Here, what we're going to argue is that CSL should increase education for women, and in turn, that should increase their labor market opportunities. Typically speaking, we argue that this is due to a positive return to education. And as I said, what this is going to do is this is going to increase the price of quantity, the number of increased child quantity prices. Now, as you recall, the new model suggests that that should decrease both the margins, both the intensive and the extensive margins. But we're also going to show that CSLs also make it more likely that women remain married, and that should actually decrease the cost of child quality. Now, this is going to have a slightly different effect. So what it's going to do is it will also have a negative effect on the intensive margin, but a positive effect on the extensive margin. So in this case, what we can see is that the CSLs are going to have an unambiguously negative effect on the extensive margin of fertility in this way, but there's going to be an ambiguous effect on the extensive margin in this case. So sorry, actually, I got these mixed up. There's going to be an unambiguously negative effect on the intensive margin. You're going to have less kids, but an ambiguous effect on the extensive margin, whether or not you're actually going to have kids at all. Now, the main problem with this is how that fundamental assumption has been played out. That is, there's an assumption that education improves labor market opportunities, that because education is assumed to have a causal effect on earnings. Although that was true prior to about the 2010, there have been a few papers that have arisen that have really cast doubt on this idea. And it has come from all kinds of different countries. The first is probably Pischke and von Wachter, who showed zero returns to education using experimental data from Germany. Then come Devereaux and Hart, that showed that the UK had zero returns when you were able to use bigger data sets than had been used prior to that. Grenette showed zero returns in France. And then the killer, because I'm in North America, was Stephens and Young in 2014, who showed zero returns to education in the United States when you control for region-specific trends. So this is problematic for the fertility literature because it basically torpedoes the idea that, in fact, there is a change in the price of child quantity here, because if this is to be believed, there aren't meaningful returns to education in this case. Our solution to this was to actually use Canadian data, because as I will show you, Canadian data are actually robust to these new concerns about the returns to education. So even when we control for region-specific trends, we're still going to show that there are positive returns to education. And this is going to enable us to actually kind of undertake this analysis using these types of models and using these types of assumptions. So specifically, what data do I use? So I used the 1981 and 1991 decennial census. These were accessed through research data centers in Canada. So these contain confidential data, including all the usual markers that you need to run this type of stuff, like where you were born. Unlike the United States, that's divided into states. Canada is divided into provinces. That's the equivalent thing. So this has information on your own education, province of birth, various labor market outcomes, including income, and also retrospective information on the total number of children that a woman has given birth to, as well as things about marriage status. So this is comparatively recent data, not super recent, but comparatively recent. And the data that we accessed, that we used for compulsory schooling laws by province, that was provided by my friend Phil Oreopoulos. And how did we actually do this? Well, typically this is just a simple IV approach. So in our first stage, we used the usual IV specification. We control for birth cohort effect, fixed effects, province of birth fixed effects, census extract fixed effects, and of course, the region of birth multiplied by the province of birth effects in that way. If you note, I'm specifying the compulsory schooling laws in a very generic way. We actually have a lot of different compulsory schooling law instruments. If you look in our paper, there are like 6 different specifications that we try out, not only with school leaving ages, but also school entry ages, and also all of them together, and then the total number of years required. Just for brevity's sake, because I know I don't have all day, I will present to you the school leaving effects, but I want to assure you that the same types of effects are evident when we use different types of CSLs, namely entry laws and also the combination of the total number of years required. And then, of course, what we use in the second stage is sort of the usual approach. I'm specifying the dependent variable here in a very generic way. That's going to be both fertility outcomes, but I'm also going to show some labor market outcomes too with my Y, but it's always going to be the same specification. And again, these include all the usual fixed effects along with the region-specific time trends. Okay, so what do I show you? So just broadly, here's my first stage in terms of educational attainment. You can see that there's a pretty profound effect if we just look at the time, just the sort of the leads and lags with the introduction of school leaving laws. Again, these effects are generally robust to all kinds of different specifications. And also, if I did this with school entry laws, you would see largely the same thing. If you're going to look at what I have in terms of the regression results, the F-stats are sort of what you would think they are, where they're sort of nice and strong. The first thing that I do here is show you in this first column the impact on the total number of years of education here for women. By the way, I realize this is for women between the ages of 40 and 65. So this is the overall effect. So I have an F-stats above 70 here. Like Patty, because I'm dealing with a country that has a relatively small number of provinces, I had to use a wild cluster bootstrap here in order to get my standard errors right and all my p-values right. And these are kind of where they need to be. The other thing that you want to take note of here is that the compulsory schooling laws that we're dealing with here, they really deal with requiring people to attend grade 7 or grade 8 or something like that. And so what you can kind of see when you localize the laws in terms of their effect on the completion of a particular grade, they work well for the grades where they apply, but not so well if you go above. So basically, if I require you to attend school up to grade 7, you do it, but you don't tend to get too many extra years. So this is just a local average treatment effect, which is fine, but it's important to kind of point out how it's pushing the particular educational route here and who the kind of is really being impacted by the local average effects. Now, just in terms of the reduced form effects, what are the impacts of the laws on the total number of children that are conceived by women before and after the laws? Here's the total number of children that we have. You can kind of see that there's a big break in the trend here, both before and after the change in the laws. It definitely looks like fertility slows down once the laws are made more strict and you're required to get more education. And in terms of the extensive margin, that is the proportion who are having at least one child, again, there seems to be a significant break at the point where the laws are being introduced. So that's fine. This is all just reduced form stuff. What about the second stage results? Okay, so again, for brevity's sake, and just for brevity's sake, if you look in the paper, we have all kinds of IV results for all of the different sort of configurations of instruments that we would think about using in this case. Again, just for brevity's sake, I'm going to present the dropout effects, the school leaving law effects, but we can also do this for the other configurations, and by and large, the results are pretty much the same. So these are very robust results. So just for comparison's sake, I've got the OLS effects in the first row here and the IV effects in the second row. So what you can see is that there is a negative effect of education on the intensive margin. So if you have at least one child, then an extra year of education here is a big effect. It lowers the number of children that women are having by an average of one child. And in terms of the extensive margin, though, you see the effect going the other way. Here in this case, if you require a woman to have at least one extra year of education, this is going to make the woman about 5% more likely to have at least one child. And that's a highly significant effect. Now, this is what we were talking about when we were discussing that notion of a compression effect on fertility here. It makes it less likely that women are going to have lots of children, but it makes it more likely that they're going to have at least one. Now, this matches up with those newer models that have been proposed by Galore and buttressed by evidence from earlier periods. This is confirmation using much more recent data and CSLs that have plausible effects in this case. If you want to kind of break it out, across various points in the fertility distribution for the intensive margin, again, you can kind of see where the effect is. It doesn't really impact the choice to have at least 2 children, but it's where you start to get above that, where this effect really starts to bite. It really punches down on the likelihood of having at least 4 children or 6 children or 8 children. And again, this is sort of an example of how this is a compressing effect. Again, it doesn't sort of hit the middle of the distribution where you've got women having 2 or 3 children. What it's doing is it's really crunching down on those edges of the distribution where women are having quite a number of children here. And that's what's evident in this particular table here. And now we come down to the question of why is this happening? Well, again, what we argue is that there has to be some mechanism that's driving both the price of quality and the price of quantity. And where are those things coming from? So what we argue in the paper is, again, within the literature, there's this notion that the price of quality is related to marital status and the ability to coordinate with the spouse to share in the price of investments in the quality of a child, that is, spending time with the child or what have you. And so what we wanted to ask is, did education that was increased by changes in CSLs make it more likely that women remained married? And the answer simply is yes, it did. And we were able to get at this in 2 ways. We looked at women who are currently married versus those who are not. And it looked like in this case that education had a significant effect. It made it about 1% more likely that women were going to remain married, 1 percentage point, I should say. And also looking retrospectively, because we have women between the ages of 40 and 65 here, it's possible that they have a spouse who has since passed away. So we were actually able to look at whether or not the woman has ever been married. And indeed, the effect is even larger there. So it's possible that this kind of understates, this first column understates the impact of education on the ability to share costs with a spouse. And so that's sort of a nice sort of example of how the impact of the price of child quality could be playing out. Now, what about the price of child quantity? Again, to remind you, this revolves around the notion of improved labor market outcomes for women as a result of getting more education. And indeed, that's what we find here. So unlike these other countries where the returns to education is wiped out by the inclusion of region-specific trends, that's not the case in Canadian data. So here, we still see a positive and significant return to education for women. Certainly within the range that we see within sort of the early literature where we've found non-zero effects. And the thing to understand here is that the census collects a total income in this case. So this is annual income. So we worry about whether or not this is a labor supply effect or whether or not this is actually a wage effect. What's interesting here is that you see that there's actually a negative effect on weeks worked. That is to say that women who are getting more education, they are earning more overall, but that's not because they're working more. In fact, they're working less in this case. So this is actually an effect on the value of their work, not that it's actually just allowing them to work more or it's making them work more weeks. So that's kind of a nice thing because it's sort of nice proof that there's an increase in the price of their time within the labor market, not a labor supply effect. So to sort of wrap things up, what do we find? Again, CSL-induced changes in education have a significant effect on fertility, but in a way that had been missed by the early literature. There's an effect on the intensive margin for sure, but also on the extensive margin as well. And what we show is that there's a plausible mechanism through the returns to education and also the impact on marriage. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Harry. And we have a few minutes for discussion.
Yes.
Comments? Yeah, please.
Yes. Hi, Harry, thanks. So one thing that I think is interesting about sort of this literature on compulsory schooling laws and sort of outcomes like fertility, right, is that the compulsory schooling laws are affecting not just education of women, but education of men, right, in the area. So in any given setting, right, the effect of compulsory schooling laws on outcomes like fertility and marriage could be very, very different depending on whether the compulsory schooling laws are affecting male and female education similarly, or more for women or more for men, right? So given that, I sort of have a two-part question. One is, did you look at whether or not in this particular setting, the compulsory schooling laws are shifting education differently for men and women or similarly for men and women in the cohort? And then sort of the second part is, given that the part of the effect of compulsory schooling laws on outcomes like fertility and marriage will be operating not through just women's education, but men's education, I'm wondering, is there a reason to kind of prefer or like more of a reduced form specification, just looking directly at the effect of the laws rather than instrumenting women's education directly, given that there are other pathways?
That's a really great question. Yeah. To try to make sure I don't get lost, because there's so many good points in there. So the first thing is, what's happening with the men at the same time. So briefly, there's also significant effects for men here. So there's a meaningful impact on their educational decisions and also a meaningful effect on the returns to education for men. So that's kind of good from a policy standpoint. But it's a bigger effect for women. So basically here, women are having a bigger boost in terms of their change in education. And the returns that we see are higher for women. Now, that's useful because, you quite rightly point out, look, this is not happening in a vacuum just for women. It's happening for everyone. So what about the men? So here, I think my best response would be to say that, if you kind of think about this literature, it's dependent upon all kinds of things. There's a discussion about intra-household bargaining that kind of creeps its way into the literature when they talk about investment in a child quality. And so there's this sort of underlying question like, okay, you're making women more educated, you're giving them better labor market opportunities, but suppose that, men just get balanced off in exactly the same way. The intra-household bargaining wouldn't change. So in this case, if it's the case that, women are sort of are the ones who are sort of bearing the disproportionate cost of investments in child quality, then this doesn't really change anything per se. But I guess, say two things to that, which is, first of all, the bargaining power seems to be improving for women relative to men as a result of the imposition of these laws. That would suggest that for women, the price of quality is lowering, in a sense that, if you believe the intra-household bargaining rules or intra-household bargaining models, then that should empower women more on that dimension. The second thing would be, if it's the case that we're making it more likely that the woman's going to remain married here, then you have the benefit of having the ability to have a spouse to sort of share that cost with, even if it's not so much, and the bargaining weren't being changed, although I believe it is. That would still be helping in this way. Now, your other point would be, have we looked at just, reduced form effects in this case, both for men and women? And the short answer is no, we haven't, but that's a great idea. That's sort of my best response in this way. But I hope that sort of makes sense. But I don't know, do you have any follow-ups on that? Awesome. Thanks for the question. That's really great. By the way, I'm a fan of your work. I've read your stuff elsewhere, so it's nice to have you in the room too.
Great. I think you can directly test the education years of education gap for the couples, right? For those exposed to the compulsory education law, to say,
yeah, we can.
Change. Right.
That's right. Yeah. No, I mean, one of the things that Phil and I have talked about is going back and there's one of my colleagues here, Aloysius Xiao, he does a lot of work on the marriage market. And, one of the things that's interesting is whether or not these compulsory schooling laws are fundamentally changing the bargaining structure and thus altering the marriage market in some kind of way. And it's an idea that, we've been sort of kicking around, but haven't quite gotten to yet. But I completely agree. And I think that testing on that difference between men and women directly with the CSLs, that would speak to that directly. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Thank you. We have 1 minute. Oh, less than 1 minute. Any burning question before we end the session? If I may, I just want to add one comment or question. So it's striking, you find the compressing pattern of the fertility. People have fewer children and more people having one. So I assume those are different people, right? So it might be interesting to look at how much they could overlap. Because thinking about young women coming to enter the childbearing age. So they could originally think about having more kids, having 5 kids or 4 kids, but with that education, maybe they reduce to having 1. Or they are very different groups. I'm not sure whether they overlap.
Yeah, so I agree. So just to be clear, it's not having exactly 1; it's having at least 1.
At least 1.
Yeah. But you're right, though. I mean, I think that when you're sort of thinking about fertility decisions, likely you're thinking about different groups where, am I going to have 3 versus 4 versus am I going to have 0 versus 1? I do agree that I think those are distinct groups. And I think drilling down a bit more into sort of thinking about whether or not there's an overlap there or not. I think that's a very useful suggestion.
Thank you. And I see no question.
One more.
Yeah.
Harry, so I understand that education changes the price of quality and quantity, but it also changes the price of when you have a baby, right?
Yeah.
Do you analyze that and how that affects the fertility?
So I'm not trying to kind of flag my own work. We have a separate paper on the impact of education on teenage fertility. So what we find there is kind of what you would expect, which is that you're absolutely right. It's basically an impact where if you force a woman to get 1 extra year of education, this pushes out or makes it more likely that her first birth will occur later as well. That's exactly right. So, what we found in that paper was that, using the same type of time frame, when the teenage fertility was happening, it was typically happening in the age 15, 16, 17 bracket. So these laws, what they would do is they would essentially push that out. So it would sort of get delayed by a year or 2. So what we found was that it didn't decrease the likelihood of being a teen mother, but it changed the timing of being a teen mother and made it got you closer to 18 in that way. So that's sort of it. Now, that said, we didn't look at more broad timings of when people had their children. The trick to that is that the Canadian census is a little bit blind on that issue, because what we can ask is, how many children did you have? But the only way to get a notion of when those children were born is if they're still in the household. And then the problem is, well, then you're kind of required to deal with, children who are probably 16 or under. Otherwise, they start going away at that point. And then, that really limits your window down. So you can sort of back it out, but it's become the measurement error kind of becomes your enemy at that point. But there, the other thing to do is to look for other data sources to look more at the timing issue. So, that's a potentially fruitful avenue too.
Yeah, I meant that not only because it would delay, but by delaying it, you can reduce the number of kids, right? If you start like I did very old, you're not going to be able to have 4 kids, right? Or 5. And so in that sense, it could be another mechanism through which it affects quantity of children, right?
I take the point. Yeah, that's well taken. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Thank you. With such rich discussions on all the 5 papers, so we are at the end of the session. So Klaus, do you have anything to announce before we end?
No, nothing besides the fact that you can enjoy the conversation again sometime in the next 1 or 2 weeks or so on the GLO website. We are doing very well. We're doing very well the whole day already. Unfortunately or fortunately, Sergio, who just joined here, at least with picture, and I have to be in other sessions in this evening and enjoy more because this conference goes 24 hours. We will see how this works, but you are the last German population economics session. So as the editor, I have to thank for your contributions and see you soon in another event or seeing your papers at another submission. Okay, thank you. I was parallel, I have to say that parallel in another session on the Ukraine. So that's like in the normal conference where you run from one place to the other. Okay, thank you very much. I close down now and at least I stop recording. You can still stay here and enjoy the conversation. Think about the room is open all time. Thank you.